The knock came at midnight, sharp and urgent, 3 raps against a door that should not have been touched until morning. Myra froze with her hand halfway to the light switch. She had just taken off her heels, just unpinned her hair, just allowed herself to breathe after the longest day of her life, her sister's wedding day. She looked through the peephole and her stomach dropped through the floor. It was Daniel, still in his wedding suit, tie hanging loose around his neck, eyes wide and searching, the way a man looks when he has run out of places to hide from himself. She did not open the door right away. She stood there with her palm flat against the wood, feeling her heartbeat everywhere at once, in her throat, in her wrists, behind her eyes. 6 hours ago, she had watched this man promise his life to her younger sister, Elena, in front of 200 guests and a priest and a wall of white roses. 6 hours ago, she had smiled and clapped and told herself that whatever had happened between her and Daniel 2 years earlier was a closed chapter, sealed shut, never to be opened again. Now he was standing outside her apartment at midnight, and every instinct told her that opening this door would change everything. She opened it anyway. "Daniel," she said, keeping her voice low, glancing past him down the hallway as if the walls themselves might be listening. "What are you doing here? Elena is going to wonder where you are." "She's asleep," he said. His voice cracked slightly on the word asleep, as though even saying it made him feel the weight of what he was doing. "I couldn't stay in that room. I kept looking at her and all I could think about was you." Myra felt the floor tilt beneath her. She had spent 2 years building walls around this exact moment, convincing herself it would never come, that Daniel had moved on completely, that whatever spark had once existed between them had been nothing more than a brief and foolish mistake made before he ever knew Elena existed. She had told herself that so many times that she had almost believed it. "You need to leave," she said, though her hand did not move to close the door. "This is not just wrong, Daniel, it's dangerous for you, for Elena, for me." "I know," he said. "I know exactly how this looks, but I had to see you before the sun came up. I had to say it out loud to someone, even if that someone is the one person I should never say it to." She should have shut the door in his face. Later, she would replay this moment 100 times and wonder what would have happened if she had simply turned the lock and walked away. But something in his voice, something raw and unguarded, kept her standing there in the doorway of her own life, letting a married man breathe the same air as her at midnight while her sister slept 2 neighborhoods away, wearing his ring for the very first time. "5 minutes," Myra said finally, stepping back to let him in, "and then you go home to your wife." The word wife hung between them, like a warning neither of them heeded. Daniel walked into her small living room the way a man walks into a courtroom, careful, aware that every step might be used against him later. He did not sit down. He stood near the window, looking out at the streetlights, his reflection ghostly in the glass. "I never stopped thinking about you," he said. "Not once, not during the entire relationship with Elena, not even standing at the altar today." Myra crossed her arms, partly to keep warm, partly to keep herself from moving closer to him. "You proposed to her, Daniel. You planned a wedding. You stood in front of everyone we know and promised forever." "I thought if I married her, the feelings for you would fade," he admitted, turning to face her. "I thought commitment would be like a door closing on something I couldn't have, but it didn't close anything. It just made the wanting louder." There was a long silence. Outside, a car alarm chirped once and went quiet. Myra felt something dangerous stirring in her chest, something she had buried under years of discipline and guilt and the fierce, protective love she had for her sister. "You need to go," she said again, but this time her voice was softer, less certain. Daniel took 1 step toward her. "Tell me you don't feel anything. Tell me right now, and I will walk out that door and I will never bring this up again." Myra opened her mouth to say the words that would end this before it began, but nothing came out. The silence stretched long enough to answer the question for her, and Daniel's shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in something closer to relief, as if her silence had confirmed exactly what he came here hoping to hear. "This can't happen," Myra finally whispered. "You have to leave now." He nodded slowly, and for a moment she thought the danger had passed, that he would walk out and this would become a secret buried so deep neither of them would ever have to face it again. But as he reached the door, he turned back one last time. "I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen," he said. "I came here tonight because I needed you to know the truth, even if nothing ever comes of it, even if we never speak of this again." The door clicked shut behind him, and Myra stood alone in her apartment, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She pressed her back against the door and slid down until she was sitting on the floor, staring at the ceiling, replaying every word he had said. She thought about Alina, sleeping soundly in a new bed beside a man who had just confessed, on his wedding night, that his heart belonged to someone else. She thought about the years of trust between the two sisters, built since childhood, through every heartbreak and celebration. She thought about how one knock on a door could threaten to unravel all of it. Myra did not sleep that night. She sat awake until the sun rose, staring at her phone, waiting for a message that never came, wondering if what happened tonight was the end of something or only the very beginning. By the time morning light filled her apartment, she had made a decision. She would act as though nothing had happened. She would smile at family gatherings, hug her sister, congratulate the happy couple, and bury this secret so deep that even she would eventually forget it existed. She did not yet know how impossible that promise would be to keep. 2 days later, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She almost didn't open it. Something told her, deep in her gut, that opening that message would be the first step down a road she could never walk back from. She opened it anyway. It was Daniel, just 3 words, "I can't stop." Myra stared at those words for a long time before deleting the message without replying. But deleting a message does not delete the feeling behind it, and she knew, even as she pressed her thumb against the screen, that this was far from over. Somewhere across the city, in a home he now shared with her sister, Daniel was thinking about her too, and the distance between silence and disaster had never felt so thin. 3 weeks passed, and Myra convinced herself the danger had cooled. Daniel had not shown up at her door again. He had not sent another message. Family dinners came and went, and she sat across from him and Alina at the same table, passing dishes of food, laughing at the same jokes, acting the part of a devoted older sister so convincingly that even she began to believe her own performance. Then came the Sunday afternoon that shattered the illusion completely. Alina had asked Myra to help pick out curtains for the new apartment she shared with Daniel, a small errand between sisters that should have been simple and warm. They walked through a home goods store together, comparing fabric swatches, Alina chattering happily about paint colors and furniture arrangements, her voice full of the easy joy of a woman freshly married and certain of her future. "Daniel wants the living room to feel bright," Alina said, holding up a pale yellow curtain sample. "He said something about wanting the house to feel like sunshine. Isn't that sweet?" Myra forced a smile, nodding, though the mention of his name sent an uncomfortable jolt through her chest. "That's a lovely thought," she managed. "He's been a little distant lately, actually," Alina continued, oblivious to the tension building beside her. "Distracted. I thought maybe it was work stress, but he barely talks during dinner anymore. Sometimes I catch him staring at his phone like he's waiting for something." Myra's fingers tightened around the curtain sample in her hands. She said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. Any word she offered might crack the surface of a secret she had promised herself she would carry alone. "Do you think something is wrong?" Alina asked, turning to face her sister directly. Searching her eyes the way she had done since they were children, trusting Myra to always tell her the truth. "Marriage takes adjustment," Myra said carefully. "Give him time. New routines are hard for everyone." Alina seemed to accept this, nodding slowly, and the conversation moved on to other things. But Myra noticed with a growing unease how easily her sister trusted her, how completely Alina believed that her older sister would never keep something this important from her. That trust, once so comforting, now felt like a blade resting against Myra's own conscience. That evening, back in her apartment, Myra's phone buzzed again. This time it was not an unknown number. Daniel had saved himself into her contacts under a different name, something innocent and unremarkable, the kind of disguise a man uses when he wants to hide in plain sight. The message read, "I saw you both at the store today. You looked happy together. I wish I could have been part of that without all of this weighing on me." Myra's hands trembled as she read it. He had been watching, not confronting, not approaching, but watching from a distance, inserting himself into moments that were never meant to include him. She typed a reply and deleted it 3 times before finally sending something firm. "Stop this. Stop watching. Stop messaging me. You have a wife who loves you and she is my sister. This has to end before it destroys everyone." His reply came almost instantly, as if he had been staring at his screen waiting for her response. "You're right, I'll stop, I promise." But promises made by a man already breaking one vow rarely hold much weight, and Myra knew this even as she read his words. She turned off her phone that night and told herself she would not check it again until morning, a small act of discipline meant to protect whatever peace she had left. The peace did not last. Over the following month, small things began to shift in ways that Myra could not ignore. Daniel started attending family functions with a strange eagerness, arriving early, staying late, positioning himself near Myra whenever conversations allowed it. He would ask about her work, her weekend plans, small details that seemed innocent on the surface but felt, to Myra, like threads being carefully gathered. At her cousin's birthday celebration, he maneuvered a seat directly across from her at the long dinner table, engaging her in conversation about a book she had mentioned once in passing months earlier, a detail he had clearly remembered and held onto. Alina sat beside him, glowing and unaware, occasionally reaching over to squeeze his hand, unaware that his attention kept drifting toward her sister across the table. Myra excused herself early that night, claiming a headache, desperate to escape the suffocating tension of pretending everything was normal while every glance from Daniel felt like a silent accusation, a reminder of the secret they now shared. In the parking lot, as she fumbled for her car keys, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, already knowing who it would be. "You left without saying goodbye," Daniel said, hands in his pockets, his breath visible in the cool evening air. "That was the point," Myra replied, opening her car door. "Daniel, you cannot keep doing this. Showing up wherever I am, remembering details about my life, staring at me across dinner tables while my sister sits right beside you. It has to stop." "I know how it looks," he said, stepping closer. "But I can't just turn off what I feel because it's inconvenient or wrong. I've tried. Believe me, I've tried." "Trying isn't good enough," Myra said, her voice rising despite her effort to stay calm. "You made a choice. You chose Alina. You stood in front of everyone and promised her your life. If you can't honor that promise, the solution is not chasing after her sister in dark parking lots." Daniel's expression shifted, something almost desperate flickering across his face. "What if I made the wrong choice? What if the promise I made was built on trying to convince myself that the right choice was possible, when the entire time it wasn't?" Myra felt tears sting the corners of her eyes, not from sadness but from the exhausting weight of holding this secret alone, of being caught between protecting her sister and confronting feelings she had never fully allowed herself to examine. "That is not my burden to carry, Daniel. You made this mess. You need to be the one to fix it, and fixing it does not involve me." She got into her car and drove away, watching him grow smaller in her rearview mirror, standing alone in the parking lot under a flickering streetlight. But even as the distance between them grew, She knew the real distance, the emotional one, had only tightened its grip. The days that followed brought a strange new tension into Myra's life. She began declining invitations to family events, inventing excuses about work deadlines and exhaustion, anything to avoid being in the same room as Daniel and Alina together. But avoidance only seemed to intensify his pursuit. He began appearing at places he had no reason to be: the coffee shop near her office, the gym she attended on weekday mornings, even the grocery store she visited after work. Each encounter followed the same pattern. He would act surprised to see her, though the surprise never reached his eyes. He would ask a few casual questions, linger a moment too long, and then leave with a lingering glance that made Myra's skin crawl with a mixture of guilt and fear. She began to suspect that Alina's earlier comment about Daniel being distracted was not simply about work stress. Something in her sister's home life was shifting, and Myra feared she knew exactly why. The confirmation came on a rainy Thursday evening, when Alina called her sister in tears. "He's been so cold lately," Alina said, her voice thick with emotion. "I ask him what's wrong and he just says he's tired, but Myra, something feels different. Sometimes he looks at me like he's somewhere else entirely, like his mind is 1,000 miles away." Myra sat frozen on her couch, phone pressed to her ear, guilt twisting sharp and hot in her stomach. "Have you talked to him directly about how you're feeling?" "I've tried," Alina said. "He just says he loves me and that everything is fine, but I don't believe him anymore. Something is wrong and I don't know what it is." Myra closed her eyes, feeling the full weight of the secret pressing down on her chest. Every fiber of her being wanted to protect her sister from pain, and yet the very thing causing that pain was something Myra herself was now tangled inside of, whether she wanted to be or not. "Maybe you should ask him directly," Myra suggested carefully. "Sometimes marriages go through rough patches early on. It doesn't necessarily mean something terrible is happening." But even as she said the words, she knew they were hollow. A thin comfort offered to soften a truth she could not yet bring herself to speak aloud. After the call ended, Myra sat in silence for a long time, staring at the rain streaking down her window. She thought about how simple her life had been before that midnight knock on her door, before a wedding day confession had cracked open something she had spent years trying to keep buried. She thought about confronting Daniel directly, demanding he choose a side and commit to it fully, whether that meant working to repair his marriage or ending it honestly instead of dragging both sisters through a slow and painful unraveling. But every time she considered speaking to Alina about what had truly happened, fear stopped her. Fear of destroying her sister's trust. Fear of being blamed for something she never asked for. Fear of losing the one relationship in her life that had always felt unbreakable. That fear kept her silent for weeks longer than it should have, and silence, she would soon learn, was its own kind of danger. One evening, while organizing old photographs for a family album Alina had asked her to help assemble, Myra came across a picture from years earlier, long before Daniel had entered either of their lives. It showed the two sisters as teenagers, arms wrapped around each other, laughing at something long forgotten, their faces bright with an uncomplicated happiness that felt like it belonged to different people entirely. Staring at that photograph, Myra felt something inside her harden into resolve. She could not continue living in this uncertain space between loyalty and self-preservation. Something had to change, and soon, before the secret she carried grew too heavy to hide any longer. She picked up her phone and typed a message to Daniel, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. "We need to talk, somewhere public, tomorrow." His reply came within seconds. "Name the place." Myra stared at the screen, aware that whatever conversation followed would set into motion consequences neither of them could fully predict. But she also understood, with a clarity that had been missing for far too long, that continuing to avoid this moment would only make the eventual collision more devastating. She typed the name of a quiet cafe across town, somewhere neither of them was likely to run into anyone they knew, and pressed send before she could talk herself out of it. Tomorrow, she told herself, this would end. One way or another, tomorrow the silence would break. The cafe was nearly empty when Myra arrived, save for a barista wiping down the counter and an elderly man reading a newspaper near the window. She chose a corner table away from prying eyes, ordered a coffee she had no intention of drinking, and waited, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later, wearing a plain jacket instead of his usual polished work attire, as though he too understood that today required something different from either of them. He sat across from her without a word, studying her face, waiting for her to speak first. "This has to stop," Myra said, skipping any pretense of small talk. "Not gradually, not eventually. Now, today. Whatever this is between us, whatever you think you feel, it cannot continue destroying my sister from the inside out." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know that? You think I haven't spent every single day since the wedding hating myself for what I've put her through?" "Then stop putting her through it," Myra said, leaning forward. "Alina called me crying last week. She knows something is wrong, she just doesn't know what. And every day you let this continue, you're making the eventual truth so much worse for her." "What do you want me to do?" Daniel asked, frustration cracking through his composed exterior. "Pretend none of this ever happened. Go home tonight and act like a perfect husband while carrying this secret for the rest of my life." "Yes," Myra said firmly. "That is exactly what you need to do, or you need to end the marriage honestly and let her rebuild her life without this hanging over her. But what you cannot do is continue this in-between space, showing up wherever I am, sending messages, looking at me across dinner tables like I'm the answer to a question you never should have asked." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier intensity, replaced by something quieter and more exhausted. "I married her because I thought it was the responsible thing to do. Our families were close. Everyone expected it. And when I looked at her, I saw someone kind and steady, someone who would build a good life with me. But kindness and steadiness were never the same as what I felt for you, even if I tried to convince myself otherwise." "Feelings change," Myra said. "What you're describing sounds less like love and more like comfort in what's familiar. Comfort is not the same as commitment, and you owe my sister the truth, not a slow unraveling that leaves her guessing what she did wrong." Daniel looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "And what about what you feel? You can't tell me there's nothing there. I saw it in your face the night of the wedding. I've seen it every time we've been in the same room since." Myra felt her resolve waver just slightly before she forced it back into place. "What I feel does not matter. What matters is that you made a promise to my sister, and breaking that promise is not my responsibility to help you navigate. I will not be the reason her marriage fails, and I will not continue meeting you in secret to discuss feelings that should never have existed in the first place." She stood up from the table, gathering her coat, preparing to leave before the conversation could pull her any deeper into a situation she desperately wanted to escape. But Daniel reached out, gently catching her wrist, not forcefully, but enough to make her pause. "Please," he said, "just give me a little more time. I'll figure out how to end things with Alina properly. I just need to find the right way to do it without destroying her." Myra pulled her hand back. "There is no right way to destroy someone's trust, Daniel. There's only honesty or continued deception. Choose honesty and choose it soon, because I will not carry this secret indefinitely." She left the cafe without looking back, walking briskly down the street, her mind spinning with everything left unsaid and everything already spoken. She had hoped the conversation would bring closure, a clean end to the tangled mess that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. Instead, it felt like she had only opened a door wider, revealing just how complicated the situation had truly become. Over the following days, Myra noticed a subtle shift in Daniel's behavior. He stopped appearing at places she frequented. He stopped sending late-night messages. For the first time in weeks, she began to believe that perhaps her firm words had finally reached him, that perhaps he intended to honor his promise to fix things properly, even if that meant painful conversations with Alina in the process. But the quiet did not bring the relief she expected. Instead, it brought a growing sense of dread, the kind that settles in before a storm, when the air goes still, and heavy and everyone instinctively senses that something is about to break. That feeling proved correct one evening when Alina showed up unannounced at Myra's apartment, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her hands trembling as she stepped through the door without waiting for an invitation. "I found something," Alina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "On his phone, messages, to someone he saved under a fake name." Myra's entire body went cold. She had known this moment might come eventually, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of standing in her own living room while her sister's world began to crumble in front of her. "What kind of messages?" Myra asked carefully, though some part of her already suspected the answer. "Messages about feelings he's never told me about," Alina said, sinking onto the couch, her hands covering her face. "Messages about wishing things had gone differently, about someone he can't stop thinking about, even after everything we've built together." Myra sat down beside her sister, her heart hammering so violently she feared Alina might somehow hear it. "Did the messages say who it was?" Alina shook her head, tears streaming freely now. "No name, just initials, M." The single letter hung in the air between them like a blade suspended above Myra's chest. She felt the full weight of the secret pressing down on her, threatening to crush the careful composure she had maintained for weeks. "I don't know what to do," Alina continued, unaware of the storm raging silently beside her. "Part of me wants to confront him immediately. Part of me is terrified of what I'll find out if I do. What if this has been going on since before we even got married? What if I married a man who never fully chose me?" Every word felt like a direct strike against Myra's already fragile composure. She wanted desperately to comfort her sister, to offer reassurance, but every reassuring word felt like another layer of deception piled onto an already unstable foundation. "You need to talk to him," Myra finally said, her voice shakier than she intended. "Ask him directly. Demand the truth, whatever it costs both of you." "Will you come with me?" Alina asked suddenly, looking up with pleading eyes. "I don't think I can face him alone, not about something like this." Myra felt panic rising in her throat. The thought of standing beside her sister while Daniel confessed the truth, potentially revealing her own name in the process, filled her with a fear so intense she could barely breathe. "Alina, I don't think that's a good idea," Myra said carefully. "This needs to be between the two of you. Adding me to the conversation might complicate things further." "Please," Alina begged, gripping her sister's hand tightly. "You've always been the strong one. I need you there. I can't do this without you." Trapped between her sister's desperate plea and the terrifying possibility of exposure, Myra felt the walls of her carefully constructed silence beginning to collapse around her. She had spent weeks trying to protect Alina from the truth, believing that silence was the kinder path, the one that would cause the least damage. But standing there, watching her sister unravel in real time, she began to understand that her silence had never truly been protective. It had only delayed an inevitable reckoning, and now that reckoning was arriving whether she was ready for it or not. "Okay," Myra said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll come with you, but Alina, whatever happens tonight, whatever gets said, I need you to remember that I love you more than anything in this world." Alina looked at her curiously, something flickering behind her tear-filled eyes, as though some part of her already sensed that Myra's words carried a weight far heavier than simple comfort. But grief and confusion clouded her ability to question it further, and she simply nodded, pulling her sister into a tight embrace. "Thank you," Alina whispered. "I don't know what I would do without you." As they held each other, Myra felt tears slip silently down her own cheeks, tears born not just from sympathy for her sister's pain, but from the crushing knowledge of what was about to unfold. Somewhere across the city, Daniel was likely sitting alone in the home he shared with Alina, unaware that the fragile secret protecting all three of them was about to be shattered completely. They arranged to meet him that same night, Alina insisting there was no reason to wait, that every additional hour of uncertainty felt unbearable. Myra agreed, though every step toward Alina's apartment felt like walking toward a cliff edge she could no longer avoid. The drive there passed in near silence, Alina staring out the window, absently twisting her wedding ring around her finger, while Myra gripped the steering wheel tightly, rehearsing words in her mind that she knew would never adequately prepare her for what was coming. When they arrived, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table, phone in hand, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as both sisters walked through the door together. "Alina, what's going on?" he asked, rising from his chair. "Why is Myra here?" Alina crossed her arms, her earlier tears replaced by a steely resolve that reminded Myra of their childhood, of a younger sister who had always fought fiercely for the truth, even when the truth was painful. "I found the messages, Daniel," Alina said, her voice trembling but firm. "I know there's someone else. I want to know who, and I want to know now." The room fell into a silence so complete that Myra could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Daniel's eyes flicked briefly toward Myra, a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity, before he turned back to face his wife. "Alina," he began slowly, "there's something I need to tell you, and it's not going to be easy to hear." Myra closed her eyes, bracing herself for the moment that would change everything, knowing that whatever words came next would tear apart the careful fabric of trust that had held their family together for so long. "Just say it," Alina said, her voice cracking under the strain of waiting. "Whatever it is, I need to hear it directly from you." Daniel glanced once more at Myra, a silent plea passing between them, though Myra gave him nothing in return, no permission, no reassurance, only a steady gaze that told him this moment belonged entirely to him now. "The messages you found," Daniel began, his voice unsteady, "they were meant for someone I knew before we got together. Someone I had feelings for a long time ago, feelings I thought I had moved past when I chose to marry you." Alina's hands trembled at her sides. "Thought you moved past? Daniel, you sent those messages after our wedding, weeks after. That's not the past, that's right now." "I know," Daniel said, his composure cracking further. "I know how it looks, and I know there's no excuse that makes this acceptable. I've been struggling since the wedding, trying to reconcile feelings I thought were gone with the reality of the life I built with you." "Who is she?" Alina demanded, stepping closer, her voice rising with each word. "You said the initial was M. Who is M, Daniel?" The silence that followed stretched unbearably long. Myra felt every second of it pressing against her chest like a physical weight, her mind racing through every possible way this conversation could unfold, none of them offering any path that did not end in devastation. Daniel opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, clearly wrestling with the decision in front of him. Finally, his eyes moved to Myra, lingering there just long enough for Alina to notice the direction of his gaze. Alina followed his eyes, turning slowly to look at her sister, confusion transforming into dawning horror as the pieces began to assemble themselves in her mind. "Myra," she said slowly, testing the name as though speaking it aloud might somehow prove it wrong. "M is for Myra." The room seemed to tilt beneath Myra's feet. She had rehearsed 100 different versions of this moment in her mind, imagined 100 different ways to soften the blow, but standing here now, watching realization crash over her sister's face, every rehearsed word evaporated completely. "Alina," Myra said, her voice barely audible, "please let me explain." "Explain what?" Alina's voice broke into something raw and wounded, a sound Myra had never heard from her sister before, not even during their most painful childhood arguments. Explain how my own sister has been the person my husband can't stop thinking about. How long has this been going on, Myra? How long have you both been lying to me? Nothing happened after your wedding, Myra said quickly, desperate to offer some measure of truth amid the wreckage. I promise you, Alina, I never encouraged this. Daniel came to my apartment the night of your wedding, and I told him to leave. I have spent every day since trying to protect you from exactly this moment. Protect me? Alina's laugh came out sharp and bitter, entirely unlike her usual warmth. You protected me by keeping secrets, by meeting him in cafes, by letting this drag on for weeks while I sat at home wondering what was wrong with our marriage, blaming myself for something that was never my fault to begin with. Daniel stepped forward, attempting to intervene. Alina, please, this isn't Myra's fault. I'm the one who pursued this. I'm the one who couldn't let go of feelings I should have buried long before we ever got married. Don't, Alina snapped, holding up a hand to stop him. Don't you dare try to protect her right now. I trusted both of you. I trusted my husband to be faithful, and I trusted my sister to tell me the truth if something was wrong. Instead, I've been living inside a lie constructed by the two people I love most in this world. Tears streamed freely down Alina's face now, though her voice remained steady, fueled by an anger that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing second. How long, Myra? I need to know. Before the wedding? During the wedding? Tell me the truth right now, because I refuse to spend one more day wondering. Myra felt the full weight of years of loyalty and love colliding against the impossible burden of this moment. There was something between us, briefly, 2 years before you and Daniel ever met, she admitted, her voice trembling. It ended before either of us knew he would eventually meet you. I never imagined, not for 1 second, that it would come back into either of our lives this way. And the night of the wedding, Alina pressed, what happened that night? He came to my apartment, Myra said. He told me he had feelings he couldn't ignore. I told him to leave, and he did. I have spent every single day since then trying to keep this from destroying your marriage, trying to protect you from exactly what is happening right now. Alina stared at her sister for a long, silent moment, something shifting behind her eyes, a painful recalibration of every memory she held of the person she thought she knew best in the world. You should have told me immediately, she finally said, her voice quieter now, though no less devastated. That very night, Myra. You should have called me and told me the truth, no matter how much it hurt, instead of letting me live inside this lie for weeks while you two figured out how to manage it between yourselves. I was trying to protect you, Myra repeated, though even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow now, insufficient against the depth of betrayal her sister clearly felt. You weren't protecting me, Alina said. You were protecting yourself and maybe protecting him too, whether you meant to or not. Real protection would have meant giving me the truth and letting me decide how to handle it, not deciding for me what I could and couldn't handle. The accusation landed with brutal precision, and Myra found she had no adequate response, because somewhere deep inside, she recognized the painful truth in her sister's words. She had told herself she was protecting Alina, but perhaps she had also been protecting her own fragile sense of control over an impossible situation, avoiding the discomfort of confrontation for as long as she possibly could. Daniel, watching the exchange between the sisters, finally spoke again, his voice heavy with regret. Alina. None of this is Myra's fault. I made the choice to pursue something I shouldn't have. I made the choice to show up at her door on our wedding night. Whatever anger you feel, it belongs directed at me, not at her. Alina turned to face him, her expression hardening into something cold and resolute. I feel anger toward both of you, Daniel, though I suppose it's true that you carry the greater responsibility. You made vows to me. You stood in front of our families and promised faithfulness, and you broke that promise before our marriage had even truly begun. She walked toward the bedroom, removed her wedding ring, and placed it deliberately on the kitchen counter between them, the small gesture carrying more finality than any words could have expressed. "I need both of you to leave," Alina said, her voice steady despite the tears still falling. "This is still my home for now, and I cannot stand here another moment looking at either of you." "Alina, please," Myra began, reaching toward her sister, desperate to offer some form of comfort despite knowing she had forfeited any right to provide it. Alina stepped back, avoiding the touch entirely. "Not tonight, Myra. Maybe not for a long time. I need space to understand how the two people I trusted most managed to build an entire secret world I knew nothing about." Daniel gathered a few belongings in silence, his movements slow and deliberate, as though delaying his departure might somehow soften the devastation unfolding around him. Myra lingered near the door, unwilling to leave without some final attempt at reconciliation, though every attempt she made only seemed to deepen the wound rather than heal it. "I love you, Alina," Myra said finally, her voice breaking. "Whatever happens between us after tonight, please know that has never changed." Alina looked at her sister, something complicated flickering across her tear-streaked face, love and betrayal tangled together in a way that seemed impossible to separate. "I loved you too," she said quietly. "I'm not sure how long it will take before I can say that in the present tense again." The words struck Myra harder than any anger could have, because they carried no bitterness, only exhausted honesty, a truth too painful to soften with false reassurance. Myra left the apartment that night carrying a grief unlike anything she had experienced before, not just the loss of her sister's trust, but the crushing realization that her attempts to protect Alina had ultimately caused far greater harm than an early, honest confession ever could have. Daniel found her in the parking lot standing beside her car, unable to bring herself to drive away just yet. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never meant for any of this to hurt you the way it clearly has." Myra turned to face him, exhaustion and grief hardening into something firm and unmistakable. "This is not about me, Daniel, and it never should have been. You broke a promise to my sister, and instead of handling it honestly from the start, you dragged both of us into a slow, painful collapse that could have been avoided entirely. Whatever happens between you and Alina moving forward, I need you to understand that I want nothing further to do with any of this. Not with you. Not with whatever complicated feelings brought us here." She got into her car without waiting for a response, driving away into the night, leaving behind a marriage in ruins and a sister whose trust she was no longer certain she could ever fully repair. The weeks that followed felt like moving through fog, each day blurring into the next as Myra attempted to process the enormity of what had unfolded. Alina filed for an annulment shortly after that devastating night, choosing not to prolong the pain of a marriage built on a foundation that had cracked before it ever truly began. Family members, once unaware of the full story, slowly learned fragments of the truth, and the fallout rippled outward through gatherings and conversations that grew increasingly strained and uncomfortable. Myra found herself isolated in ways she had never experienced before, caught between a family struggling to process a painful betrayal and her own guilt over choices she now recognized as deeply flawed, however well-intentioned they had once seemed. 6 months passed before Myra worked up the courage to reach out to her sister again. In that time, she had moved through stages of grief she had never expected to associate with a relationship that had not technically ended in death, yet felt every bit as final. She grieved the version of her family that existed before that midnight knock on her apartment door. She grieved the easy trust she and Alina had once shared, the kind that allowed for shared secrets and unguarded laughter without fear of judgment. She grieved, too, the version of herself who had believed, mistakenly, that silence could ever truly protect someone she loved. During those months, Myra threw herself into work, accepting projects that kept her occupied late into the evenings, anything to avoid sitting alone with her thoughts for too long. She moved through her days efficiently, professionally, earning praise from colleagues who had no idea about the storm she carried quietly beneath the surface. But no amount of professional distraction could fully erase the ache of estrangement from the person who had once been her closest confidant. Daniel, she learned through mutual acquaintances, had moved to a different city entirely, taking a transfer at his company that removed him from the daily reminders of the life he had shattered. Myra felt no particular curiosity about his new circumstances, no lingering pull toward reconnection. Whatever complicated feelings had once existed between them had been thoroughly extinguished by the devastation those feelings had caused, replaced instead by a quiet, resolute clarity that she wanted nothing more to do with him, now or ever again. It was Alina who finally reached out first, sending a simple message one evening that read only, "Can we talk?" Myra stared at those 3 words for nearly an hour before responding, her hands trembling with a mixture of hope and fear she had not expected to feel so intensely. They agreed to meet at a small park near their childhood neighborhood, a place that held decades of shared memories, from childhood bicycle rides to teenage heart-to-hearts on the same wooden bench where they now sat, several careful feet apart, unsure how to bridge the distance that had grown between them. "I've been thinking a lot about that night," Alina said finally, breaking the tense silence between them, "about everything that led up to it and everything that happened after." Myra nodded, unwilling to interrupt, sensing that her sister needed space to say whatever she had come here to express. "I was so angry," Alina continued, staring out at the small pond in front of them, watching a family of ducks glide across the water. "Angry at Daniel, obviously, but angrier at you than I think I even understood at the time. I felt like the 2 people I trusted most had built an entire secret life around me without my knowledge." "I understand that anger," Myra said quietly. "I've spent the last 6 months trying to understand it myself, trying to figure out where I went wrong, and I think I finally understand it clearly now." Alina turned to look at her sister, curiosity replacing some of the earlier tension in her expression. "What do you mean?" "I convinced myself that staying silent was the same as protecting you," Myra explained, choosing her words carefully. "I thought if I could handle the situation quietly, keep Daniel away, manage everything behind the scenes, that I could spare you from unnecessary pain. But protection built on secrets isn't really protection at all. It's control, dressed up to look like kindness. And you deserve the truth from the very beginning, even if that truth would have hurt you immediately instead of gradually." Alina was quiet for a long moment, processing her sister's words. "I think part of me always knew that, even during the months I refused to speak with you. I kept replaying that conversation in the kitchen, wondering what would have been different if you had called me the morning after the wedding instead of trying to manage it all yourself. I ask myself that same question every single day," Myra admitted. "I think about how much pain could have been avoided if I had trusted you enough to handle the truth immediately, instead of assuming I needed to shield you from it." "I forgave Daniel a while ago," Alina said, surprising Myra with the admission. "Not because what he did was acceptable, but because holding onto that anger was exhausting me more than it was punishing him. He reached out a few months ago, apologized properly, and I think we've both moved on in our own ways." "And us?" Myra asked carefully, almost afraid to voice the question aloud. "Where does that leave us?" Alina reached over, finally closing the physical distance between them on the bench, taking her sister's hand in hers. "It leaves us here, I suppose, trying to figure out how to rebuild something that got broken. I'm not going to pretend the trust comes back overnight, Myra. It doesn't work that way. But I miss you. I miss having my sister in my life, and I think punishing both of us further by staying apart doesn't actually help either of us heal." Tears filled Myra's eyes, relief and gratitude flooding through her at words she had feared she might never hear again. "I miss you too, more than I know how to properly express. I am so deeply sorry for the pain I caused, for the silence I mistook for protection. If I could go back and do it differently, I would tell you everything that very first morning, no matter how much it hurt in the moment. "I believe you," Alina said, squeezing her sister's hand. "And I think in a strange way, this entire situation taught me something important about trust and honesty that I might not have learned otherwise. It taught me that real love, whether between sisters or spouses, requires the courage to speak difficult truths immediately, even when silence feels like the easier, kinder choice in the moment." They sat together on that bench for a long while, watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon, the golden light stretching long shadows across the quiet park. It was not a complete resolution, not yet. Trust, once broken, requires patient rebuilding, careful and deliberate, brick by brick, over months and sometimes years. But it was a beginning, a genuine step toward healing that neither sister had been certain would ever arrive. In the months that followed, Myra and Alina slowly rebuilt their relationship, starting with small gestures, a weekly phone call, an occasional dinner together, gradually working their way back toward the closeness they had once shared so effortlessly. It was not the same as before. Some innocence had been lost permanently in that painful confrontation. Some easy trust replaced by a more careful, intentional kind of closeness that acknowledged the fragility of relationships and the importance of honesty in maintaining them. Alina eventually found happiness again with someone new, a kind and steady man named Julian who had no complicated history tangled up with anyone in her family. Myra watched her sister fall in love again with a mixture of joy and quiet relief, grateful to see Alina rebuilding a life unmarked by the shadow of betrayal that had once threatened to define her future. As for Myra, she took the painful lessons of that year and applied them deliberately to every relationship moving forward, choosing honesty over comfortable silence, even when honesty felt more difficult in the immediate moment. She understood now, in a way she never had before, that protecting the people she loved meant trusting them with difficult truths, not shielding them from realities they deserved to know. Years later, at a family gathering celebrating Alina's engagement to Julian, the two sisters stood together in the kitchen, preparing food for the guests arriving that evening, laughing easily at a shared memory from their childhood. The scene looked almost identical to countless family gatherings before the painful year that had once threatened to tear them apart permanently. Yet something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, a deeper appreciation for the relationship they had both fought so hard to rebuild. "Do you ever think about that year?" Alina asked suddenly, pausing while chopping vegetables for the evening meal. Myra considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes. Not with the same pain it used to bring, though. More like a difficult lesson that ultimately made us stronger, even though I would never wish that particular pain on anyone." Alina nodded thoughtfully. "I used to think forgiveness meant forgetting what happened, pretending it never occurred. But I've realized forgiveness actually means remembering fully, understanding the pain completely, and choosing to move forward anyway because the relationship matters more than the mistake." "That's a beautiful way to think about it," Myra said softly, reaching over to squeeze her sister's hand, a gesture that had become their quiet way of reaffirming the bond they had worked so hard to restore. As the evening progressed and family members filled the house with laughter and celebration, Myra found herself reflecting on how far they had traveled since that devastating night in Alina's kitchen. The path had been painful, filled with difficult conversations and slow, deliberate healing, but it had ultimately led them somewhere stronger and more honest than where they had started. Sometimes, Myra thought, watching her sister laugh freely with her new fiancé across the crowded room, the most painful chapters of our lives become the very foundation upon which we build something far more resilient than what existed before. The knock on her door that midnight had once felt like the beginning of an unraveling, a threat to everything she held dear. But looking back now, she understood it differently, as the painful catalyst that eventually forced both sisters to confront difficult truths about honesty, protection, and the real meaning of unconditional love. Their relationship, once broken so completely, had not simply been repaired. It had been rebuilt entirely, stronger and more resilient in its new form, grounded in a hard-won understanding that true love between family members requires courage, honesty, and the willingness to face painful truths together, rather than allowing well-intentioned silence to slowly erode the trust that holds every relationship together. As the celebration continued late into the evening, Myra raised her glass alongside the rest of the family, toasting to Alina's new beginning, grateful beyond words for the second chance they had both been given to rebuild what once seemed permanently lost. Some bonds, she had come to understand, are strong enough to survive even the most painful betrayals, provided both people involved are willing to do the difficult work of honest reconciliation. And as she watched her sister's face light up with genuine happiness, Myra knew, with quiet certainty, that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together this time, with nothing hidden between them ever again.